Welcome to another Redwall review. Today we are talking about Triss. You will notice this looks a bit different than the other Redwall books in my collection. That is because, unfortunately, by the time this one comes out, the publishing company that had released editions of these books where I lived up until the Tagarong stopped putting them out. As a kid, I was kind of disappointed because I wanted my set to all match, but oh well, this is very much a pretty book cover in its own right. This is my first time doing a Redwall book review in a while. I didn't post a new review of the one that comes between this and Lord Brocktree, which is the Tagarong, because a year ago I did another review of the Tagarong, and while at the time I hadn't read it in the context of the whole series and might have appreciated some tiny little bits about it that I didn't before, for the most part, I thought my thoughts on the book were the same as I expressed in my original video at the time. So now I find myself here talking about Triss, having just read the book. And on the one hand, it's becoming increasingly hard to talk about this in the way I managed to talk about all the other books up until now, trying to do a sort of relatively deep thematic analysis. I think by the time we get to Triss, it's pretty clear that every variant within the Redwall series has been explored. And at this point, Brian Jacques can really just remix things. So everything felt like it was a parallel to something else. So you have this sort of villainous family in which you have the most evil of them all is the sister, the most sympathetic is her brother. I'll get to that more later.
The point is, the evil royal family in this book feels like a rewrite of the evil royal family from Mossflower.
You have people escaping from slavery and planning to eventually go back and free all their fellow slaves, as in Martin the Warrior. We have the discovery of an old piece of Redwall architecture, in this case, Brockhall, the ancient home of Bella the Badger, mirroring a plot choice that was made in The Long Patrol, and so on and so on. So I feel like if Brian Jacques really innovated with this book at all, if he did anything to make it different than the rest of the series, I think he maybe turned things up with the cartoonishness of some of the characters. And the real standout point in this book is the villains. We're introduced to the main villain of this book, the evil princess Curta, a ferret, and she would have her slave, the squirrel Triss, throw turnips in the air so she could practice waving her sword. Curta speaks with a kind of weird accent. Brian Jacques phonetically writes out his accents. And at first I was kind of weirded out by it because, sometimes I know problematically he uses a kind of savage accent for some characters, but I thought it wouldn't make sense for the monarchy to speak with these accents. And then I gradually picked up on the fact, oh, they're supposed to be German accents. And someone in my Redwall Discord group even pointed out to me that these ferrets they're albinos, but they think of themselves as pure ferrets. So there's a weird Nazi motif going on in this otherwise old-fashioned book. So Curta stands out as this kind of evil girl boss character. She's a princess. She's depicted wearing very princessy clothing. One of her missions is to retrieve the sort of royal band so she can ascend the throne where she's from. But yeah, she's also just into waving around her samurai sword, so she could be like a character in Kill Bill or something. Curta has a brother named Blad, who is mostly just kind of sad all the time. He thinks everyone is being mean to him. He's basically an Augustus Gloop character in that he's fat and depicted as kind of greedy, but he's also not particularly involved in anyone in being sort of like actively villainous, except for one moment sort of towards the end of the book. As with many books in the series, the main villain has a rival villain, and is often the case that rival is a fox. And while often I don't care about the rival foxes, I particularly hated Rascanza as a waste of space in the Pearls of Lutra, in this one, Brian Jacques returns to the character of evil yet somehow still beloved pirate that he had with Clog back in Martin the Warrior. The pirate in this is named Plug Firetail, and while he engages in villainous acts, he's participating in the slave catching. Within his crew, he's a fairly egalitarian ruler. He's respected by all. When he's in danger, the members of his crew actually want to help him. His one other character flaw, though, is he's incredibly vain. He's a silver fox with this fiery red tail, and at one point he loses the tail, and this becomes a huge source of embarrassment for him. His crew also includes Grubbage, a sea rat who can't hear anything because his ears are missing, and he comically misunderstands things. And spoiler alert, This is used for Brian Jakes to basically imply that Drubbage is a good character who, because he doesn't hear half of what's told to him, doesn't really know what he's doing. He's not fully integrated into pirate culture. We also meet Stoat named Scummy, who is illustrated wearing a cute little hat. At one point in the story, writes a poem. Now, on top of that, we have another group of villains, and these are these three snakes. So the snakes have a history where I think their mother got into a fight to the death, and it was a mutual kill with Kurta and Vlad's grandfather. And as a result of that fight, these three young snakes are bound together by the mason chain of Kurta and Vlad's grandfather. So it's this terrifying hydra, these three snakes that are an absolute menace, absolute danger to anyone around them. These snakes are notable in that, other than the first book in the series, where one of the main villains was a snake, an adder like them, named Asmodeus. Since then, if snakes have appeared in the series, it's as very minor, sort of like one scene obstacle type villains. They aren't given names, they aren't given personalities, they aren't given objectives. And with these snakes, Brian Jakes actually gives them even more personality. He gives them a tragic backstory that he doesn't give to the snake Asmodeus from the first book. So when anyone talks about Redwall books, if anyone has a criticism, it's of the simple moral binary that too often gets painted in these books between good and evil. So it's hard for me to really critique that insofar as it exists in this book. And if anything, I feel like because of the cartoonish nature of so many of these villains, Brian Jakes kind of does free himself from that binary. Plug Firetail might be a bad guy in one sense, but the book clearly loves him. He's given this sort of silly eulogy at one point. The character of Vlad, while he's ultimately described as a bad guy, I guess by the good characters who don't really know the difference between him and Kurta, he's also given a bit of a character arc in that at first he's this sort of bullied buffoon, but eventually he makes friends with the pirates and almost asserts his independence from his sister before he dies. Spoiler alert, rather comical death. The one thing that did stand out to me from the good and evil perspective was the snakes, because I didn't understand why Brian Jakes gave them this kind of tragic backstory where they're chained together if the point is we're not supposed to feel sympathetic towards them. Maybe they can never be truly good characters because they're these big natural predators, but the fact that he gives them names, personalities, and struggles, I was expecting more of a Moby Dick thing where, they'll get to be triumphant in the end. They'll get to be free of this chain and live some freedom and live the Redwallers alone, rather than being treated by the Redwallers like just other evil characters. The cartoonishness of this book extends beyond the villains. So a couple other highlights of this book. We have a couple birds of prey characters, an owl and I can't remember, an eagle, a hawk or something. And while it's fairly common for Brian to include these characters as sort of not quite major, not quite minor characters in his books, these characters just sort of have one big dramatic cameo moment before, spoiler alert, they shockingly die right away. And usually when Brian Jakes has a good character die, it's either as some sort of very compelling tragedy, or it's like right at the beginning of the book. So it's a good character we didn't really get to know. This scene where, yes, these characters appear briefly, but they're in there just enough for us to get to like them, and their death is so shocking and abrupt. It was an interesting cartoonish twist towards the dark that we don't necessarily get in these other books. On the good side, however, the most cartoonish character is a hare named Scarum. So actually, in some of my earlier videos, you'll hear me making comments about how all the hares in the series are the same, and that makes it hard to differentiate them and enjoy them after a point. But as I've read more and more of this series, I realized that's not entirely a fair criticism of Brian Jakes. If we look at the very first hare, the prototype Basil Staghare, the premise is that he's modeled off a certain type of cartoonish English Royal Air Force soldier, where he's sort of very serious, very posh, a very competent soldier, but there's something about his poshness that's also comedic, and also he loves to eat. But sort of in the second half of the series, we've begun to see Brian Jakes lean into this silliness more and be willing to sort of display the silliness at the expense of that competence that the earlier hares had. So in Lord Brocktree, for example, we got Dottie, who is a bit clueless sometimes, but her heart is in the right place, and she works towards being that competent hare. In Triss, Brian takes things to another level, where this hare character, who's the best friend of a runaway badger, again, mirroring a plot choice we saw way back in Salamandastron. This time, the hare is not at all is mostly not at all competent. Mostly, he likes to eat, and unlike all the other gluttonous hares, this one eats absolutely too much to the point of regularly starving his friends or their hosts and getting in real trouble for it. And he's also not a particularly good warrior, but he is good at lying about being a good warrior and telling dramatic tales. So while I wouldn't exactly call Scarum a morally gray character, the willingness to introduce such a major character who in most contexts is kind of useless to the good guys is kind of a hindrance, that felt like a bold new choice on Brian Jakes' part. So is Triss different enough from the rest of the Redwall series that, if you're reading these all at once, especially as an older reader, you're not going to get fatigued? No, I mean, this is a book I remember almost nothing of as a kid. I think the one character I remember is Grubbage, and I feel like that's because, yeah, you can't write this many books in the series and have them be mostly similar and have people remember the 15th book in vivid detail. On the other hand, there are enough original elements in this one, the bold visuals of the snakes, the weird likability or memorability of lots of the villains, and of course, Scarum the Hare, that make this book quite enjoyable in its own right. And there are just various decisions, Brian Jakes, to make the universe a bit more colorful. He randomly introduces a hamster into the books. It feels like the first time in ages he's actually introduced a new species. So trying to stay creative while still sticking to a formula is a hard thing, but I think Brian Jakes did a good job. Wait, I think I just finished the video and basically said nothing about the title character, Triss. And that's because one of Brian Jakes' recurring faults is I don't know when in his process he would come up with these titles, but Triss does not really stand out as a character at all. I mean, she and her friend Shog, they're relatively plain good guys. They're not as memorable as the other traveling party of Sagax, Scarum, and Kruva. So there's almost an arbitrariness. The one reason I guess she becomes the title character is she is the heir to Martin the Warrior. In this book, she gets to carry Martin's sword. It has been pointed out to me, and I didn't notice this as a kid, that she's the first female character to be an official heir of Martin. And while I could appreciate that could be important to some readers, we've had so many heroines up to this point. Marielle is so much more a distinct character that it doesn't feel like there's anything special about it. The fact that Triss is technically the first one to be an official wielder of the sword, means a lot less than Marielle did as this actual groundbreaking female protagonist in the series, or even Constance did as a groundbreaking female deuteragonist in the very first book. And I guess one other final thought I'll share is that there are a few references at the beginning of this book to the previous book, The Tagarung. It's said that the skipper of the otters in the book, who's a main character in this one. It's kind of weird to have this character who doesn't have a name, just a title, be a main character. It says he's a descendant of Dana, the protagonist of The Tagarung. And we're also told the young badger in this, Sagax, is, I think they call him the fifth great grandsire, so I guess great, 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 great grandson of Rusano the Wise, who appeared at the end of The Tagarung. Now, the point of that detail about the badgers, I guess, is to imply this is a really long time because badgers live much longer than other creatures in the Redwall universe. So to be 6 generations later in badger terms is, I don't know, to be 24 generations later in everyone else's terms. And I guess that was to free Brian from the pressure of having to be consistent with his previous books. Triss marks the beginning of what I've termed the Bronze Age of Redwall books. The first 8 books are the Golden Age, in that they all take place between the lifetimes of Martin and Matthias. The next 6 books are the Silver Age, in that they either take place before or after that period, but they're all kind of loosely connected chronologically. And the last 8 books, as far as I remember, they're all just set in completely in their own time period. And it's hard to know what Brian is doing with that. If you actually try to do the math and figure out what's going on with time, you might wonder whether these books would eventually go out of the medieval ages because, just so much time has passed and these animals clearly live a lot longer than their real life biological counterparts. I guess what Brian Jakes is thinking is he just wants the comfort of the Redwall universe being eternal. So he can have all these books being set generations apart, yet still largely existing within the same medieval universe. Let me know your thoughts on this one, and I'm sure I will be back with a review of Loamhedge before too long.